drunkard up in Central Park, or the lion hunter in the jungle dark, or the Chinese dentist, or the British Queen. They are bit together in the same machine. Nice, nice, very nice, 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 very nice. So many people in the same device. Oh, a whirling dervish and a dancing bear, or a ginger rajas and a Fred Astaire, or the teenage rocker, or the girl from.
Hello, Austin. I'd like to thank you for allowing me into your homes for this 40th episode of Esoteric Science Roundtable. Today I would like to discuss the Deva Evolution. Evolution takes place at many levels in the various kingdoms in nature. And all these kingdoms are interconnected with one another and form a part of a larger system. The evolutionary or spiritual impulse makes its way through the lower kingdoms to the higher, taking with it what it has gained from each and becoming finally human, and then on to even more refined and specialized states of existence. And so that being the case, the life impulse finds its way through the mineral, the plant, the animal, and then ultimately the human, and then on past beyond that into even higher, again, higher states of existence or awareness. And again, this is an ongoing evolutionary process. It's an ongoing process of expanded awareness, understanding, and increased capacity and ability. One kingdom that works hand in hand with this process is the angel or Deva evolution. And the angel kingdom is a kingdom of builders of form. And at the higher level, these angels are called the seven angels of the presence, or seven spirits before the throne of God. These seven hold within themselves the seven types of energy that blend and form the pattern of things in the heavens, upon which our material universe of form, substance, and matter rests. These energies are the foundation of our created world. And so if we consider this process a bit, from an unmanifest state, the evolutionary process goes forward, it finds its way into what we consider manifest existence. And so at the highest level, these so-called seven spirits before the throne of God that are spoken of in biblical phraseology tie in at this level. And these seven are also known as the seven rays. And that being the case, they are not they're not really part of activity so much as they are a conditioning factor that the rest of evolution is built upon. And this Deva evolution runs parallel to human evolution, and they kind of run side by side in many respects, and coexist with one another and help one another along this path of evolution. They're also what we can consider archangels, or Dian Chohans, which is another term for these beings. They're also considered, from the biblical phraseology, the Elohim. And all these terms are different terms that fall back to this one type of angel, if you will, or the most common term likely that we're familiar with, which is the archangel. And that being the case, these are the angels, if you will, that that are the intermediaries. And they're also, another term for them is the Lords of Light. And they are another term that some may be familiar with is the term divine rebel. And that is, they've gained that name for refusing to create. And that's something that has to kind of be discussed a bit, because that can be a bit confusing. This condition has to be understood if we wish to have some insight into their work. And so with that being the case, again, the term divine rebel relates to a condition in which this angel evolution does not take part in this form life of ours, doesn't take part in the evolution, but basically stand back and kind of watch and help and guide, if you will, without actually partaking. And so this is, again, why there's some symbolic speaking of 1/3 of the angels of heaven that rebelled and refused to participate in the evolutionary process. And again, this ties back to those termed archangels, that even though they are part of the evolutionary process, they didn't come into the plane of existence in the same sense that man did, but yet nonetheless they still have their parallel evolution that ties into humanity and again works with humanity. One thing that's important to keep in mind that not many people are aware of is that all angels either have been or are becoming eventually human. Let's see, and so these angels that are called either Archangel in the West or Dayan Chohan in the East, again, have these certain qualities. And so we see, again, they're trying to eventually become human and then ultimately pass out of the human condition. The human condition is a midpoint condition in evolution, if you will, that mediates or ties together the lower kingdoms with the higher kingdoms. So humanity, being in the middle point of evolution in a sense, has a responsibility as a caretaker for animal, plant, and mineral. And then atop of that, we have the higher spiritual kingdoms that in their turn look down and guide and watch over humanity and again the lesser kingdoms. And so this is all part of a hierarchical system, and many people are probably familiar that there are many names for the different angels. And just to try to get into that would probably take up this show and several others. So I'm not really going to get so much into the individual names of angels, these individualized entities that are part of this evolution, that are known to man throughout time, that are part of this whole work. But again, some of the names, just a general term, if we consider the name seraphim and cherubim, the term cherubim means most love, and the term seraphim means most knowledge. And so we see, again, there are different gradations, ranks, or hierarchies in the angel evolution, also human and otherwise. And so we see, again, like steps on a ladder, that different individuals, different entities are at different states and places in the evolutionary process, but that doesn't mean that any one is truly higher than another. It's just that one has been at it a bit longer. One started to climb earlier than the next, and so they all fall in line and take turns, and they all work along this process. And so again, considering this legend of the fall for this certain class of beings, this angelic hosts that are considered archangel, again, 1/3 supposedly refused, according to this particular legend. They refused to take part of this evolutionary process, and that it can be a bit misleading because it wasn't so much of a refusal; it was more of an inability to be able to work with this at this level, because they've already passed on to such a high degree of evolution that they really are not able to stay back, because they have purified themselves to such a high degree that they can't soil themselves with the taint of this terrestrial activity. So again, they tend to stand behind the scenes, if you will, working nonetheless, but more so in a guiding or directing manner, perhaps in the sense that a director would direct a movie, or a music producer would kind of mold and craft and shape the music artist, and to bring a something particular out of them that they envision, that they want to have come into expression. And so again, it's an example of how this direction takes place from these, again, through the hosts of angels, from the higher to the lower, and how this chain of command works itself down ultimately into the lower kingdoms. And so that being the case, since this 1/3 refused, if you will, or were not able to partake of the human evolution, One thing that's good to keep in mind as well is that even though they aren't able at this high state to take advantage of helping humanity in our current condition, they, in a past system, were also human. Now, keeping in mind that the human condition at that time is not the same as what we have now on this dense physical planet, but nonetheless, the human condition has evolved and progressed through different phases and until it's finally culminated into what we know now as our current Earth life. And so these high angels that have partaken of the human evolution in a previous condition now find themselves much too high and much too evolved to be able to come back physically to participate in physical plane activity. That being the case, there was need for an angel, if you will, that was low enough, if we can consider that term, although that's not really a very flattering or appropriate term, but just to give an idea, an angel that was corruptible to a certain degree, that was part of this corporeal, physical evolution that could, again, become part of it more so than these higher angels were able to. And so in this case, we needed an angel that was low enough to work with the form aspect and to help with our evolutionary unfolding. And this is what we consider as the fall of Lucifer and all the symbolism that's associated with that. And so again, keeping in mind that these lower classes of angelic hosts work with the form, with matter, with substance, whereas the higher classes of angels work with consciousness. They work with spirituality, and they don't actually work with the dense physical form. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, Lucifer, as we know from the Bible symbology, did work on the physical plane and did interact intimately with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And so we see that this angel, if you will, the light bringer Lucifer, was able to penetrate into the physical plane in order to influence or affect the human life at that point in time, which we consider the Adam and Eve dispensation of human evolution. And so if we understand from the Bible and other great religious traditions that there are more than one story of evolution in the respective world's religions, that there is, first of all, an account of the building of the heavens, of the building of the spheres and the building of the larger pattern of things in the heavens. And that is based on the consciousness aspect. Then later, the lesser angels came in to fill in the detail, if you will, and to give form to this general idea, to this general concept. And so if we consider that the great devas, the Dayan Chohans, or the archangels, and the levels of angel above that are the ones that set up this divine template, if you will, this pattern, this archetype, or this architectural diagram that they are entrusted with, that they compose, and that they have the lesser builders that are entrusted with the actual building, with the hands-on, if you will, construction of form. And so that being the case, we have the initial story of the heavens being built, and the consciousness aspect filling this aspect of our evolution. And then we have a later story of evolution that starts in the Garden of Eden, and that is when form comes into place. And we see things being given a name. And anything that has a name is differentiated from the unmanifest aspect of God, the unknowable aspect of God. When it comes down into physical form, even if it's a very high form that we can't perceive with our physical senses at any level, nonetheless, there are things that have form that are outside of our understanding, but nonetheless have form. And so that being the case, again, we understand that things were given names. These are different animals, different plants. Everything that was differentiated or was made single from the one, if you will, did gain a name, were named, and this again is an example of differentiation. That you have, lion, tiger, bear, all of these things that when we think of the name, we can think of the form that is associated with that particular term. And certainly different languages are going to have different names for these particular forms, but nonetheless, once a name has been granted to something, it generally indicates that it has a form at some level. And so considering that the lower devas make up all form, that's kind of a twofold work, if you will. The lower angels, or the lower devas make up form in all things. And basically what happens is these angels bring themselves into our being. The basic archetype, if you will, or the basic foundation, the basic diagram, architectural diagram for a human, for instance, exists at some level, but for it to be filled in with this actual flesh and blood being, it takes the workers, again, the angelic classes, to actually put that plan for a person into actuality, to put that into action. And so we basically, if we want to think about it in these terms, we are made of angel essence. These angels give up their very being, their very essence, to make us. Their lesser lives comprise our lives, just in the same sense that our lesser human lives comprise and make up an even larger body, and that we are part of an even larger consciousness, on and on and on, up until, again, to the unmanifest or latent, unknowable aspect of God. But anything that takes a form that partakes of desire, which is also the nature of the soul, is going to have in its composition angel essence, for lack of a better term, that these smaller lives build and amalgamate and gather themselves onto the human form to, again, flesh out, fill out, and make this corporeal entity that we see in front of us. Now again, some of the higher angels that are part of this work have passed through the human condition, and they became what is termed individualized. Now that is something key to keep in mind. And also the whole story of the Garden of Eden represents for us when man became individualized or self-conscious. And so as this process took place, these great angels, these great devas, these archangels, were at one time in a previous cycle, still related to the human condition nonetheless, were mineral, then plant, then animal, then human, and then ultimately onto spirit, and then on even to higher work than that. And so we see the gradations and this gradual transformation that takes place. Now certainly this isn't a quick transformation by any stretch. It takes untold, countless amounts of time for this process to finally make its way through, and for, again, this evolutionary process and this unfolding to finish with the work that it has to do. And so these lower devas, again, these are angels that comprise our very being, that make up our makeup, or an animal, or a plant, or a tree. Anything that has form is going to have a deva, or an angel evolution, associated to it, that is going to make it what it is that we're able to finally see with our physical eye, that make the shape of the leaves, that make the color of the flower, on and on and on. All these things we can attribute to the angel evolution or the deva evolution. And so these lower devas, these building devas that are not yet self-conscious, or that are unable to say I am that I am in the same sense that a human can, or a higher evolved entity can, they're not yet self-conscious. They have will imposed upon them by greater intelligences, and they have not gathered the right or gained the right to free will in that sense that humanity has gained free will, and is the ultimate, basically has to pay for his choices, basically has to, any choice that he makes ultimately catches back up with him. In the sense of those lower devas, they're always impressed by a greater intelligence or a greater will than their own, and so they are kind of compelled, if you will, to do the work at hand. And so, again, these lower workers are doing the actual work, whereas the plan or the architectural diagram is being held by these higher angels that, again, make the pattern, but don't actually do the actual building work. And these lower devas are attracted by vibration. And so as a result of vibration, they are drawn to a certain entity. For instance, if a plant is in the process of being formed, then these lower devas are going to, the proper devas are going to be magnetically attracted to the archetypal form so that they can become, on the physical plane, an expression of a certain kind of plant. And we see that taking place at these various levels. Also, these lower devas, in their turn, work on even lower evolved lives that are generally termed elementals. And so they impress and compel and move these even lesser lives by virtue of the work that they're impelled to do. So the lower devas would be compelled by a higher will, and they in their turn would bring in these lesser elementals, if you will, that would do the lesser work even than they would. And there are different names that that have been attached to the elementals throughout time that some may be familiar with: fairies, sprites, gnomes, pixies. All of these little entities that we know through the fairy tales and we know through different mythology and what have you are actual entities. They are what are known as elementals, and that may be a far stretch for some people to grasp because that sounds very fanciful, and we don't really have a physical reference for these creatures, and entities, whatever you choose to term them. But if we choose to go back in time to the myths upon which these concepts were founded into antiquity, when man's comprehension was a bit more still inclined to the spiritual world, then man could commune more so with these entities, with these lower elementals, if you will, and could visually see and again interact at some level with these lives, these lesser lives. And so these little workers are in turn impressed by these lower devas, and they are the ones also that are magnetically compelled or impelled to build and to amalgamate, if you will, and join together and to build into some form. Another thing that's many people might be familiar with is the term guardian angel. All humans have a guardian angel. As far as the makeup of this guardian angel, another term for the guardian angel would be the solar angel or the human soul. So it is, in essence, our own human soul that is our own guardian angel that allows us to gather that insight that through intuition and have some understanding of the higher unknown spheres, if you will, through the soul interaction. And so the human soul or the guardian angel would be the mediator between spirit and matter, in the same sense that humanity is a mediator between the lower and the higher kingdoms. And so again, our soul or our guardian angel is something that is active in every person to a greater or lesser degree, and some people merely have commune with their guardian angel or the soul strictly through impulse and instinctual means. And so they're only able to grasp a faint little glimmer, if you will, of the intention of the soul, and are not able to really have some comprehension of what the intention of the soul is in relation to the person's life on this planet Earth. Also, we may hear that drunks, fools, and small children are protected. And we often find that this holds true. Obviously not in every instance, but in many cases it does hold true. And again, this would be something that we could attribute to this guardian angel, if you will. Now, another aspect that I touched upon a bit earlier is the idea that these lower devas or these lower angels can be moved and can be put into action by a higher will or higher intelligence. And so man, in that instance, can be the mover of these lower devas and ultimately the even lesser lives, the elementals. And so the creative faculty in man is through his thought, through his thinking process. And so as a thought is sent out, as a man thinks a thought, he sends out the thought, and it is clothed, if you will, and magnetism from that thought attracts these lesser devas and these elementals, and so they are compelled by a person's thought to bring that into manifestation in some way, to help bring that into actuality. And that can take place at many levels, but when a person thinks a thought, and especially if a person is very one-pointed and focused, then these elementals, the magnetism stays intact, and these devas and elementals can cling to this thought and flesh it out and form it out. And it's very much the same as a baby being created in the womb. If we neglect the baby that's being born in the womb, that's growing in the womb, if we neglect it and don't nurture it and don't give it the nutrition it needs, then it will die for lack of this attention and for lack of this sustenance that it needs to thrive, grow, and to be its own individual entity. And a thought is very much like that. If we can take the thought from its inception and carry it out until it finally makes its way into, again, a born thing that we can actually see demonstrated on the physical plane, that whole process that takes place from the thinking, from the man's thought, as he one-pointedly directs and focuses his thinking. Again, that magnetism, that link, that magnetic link that's set up between an individual and the goal, the thought, the idea. Again, if it's strong enough, if it's focused enough and one-pointed enough, that magnetism is strong enough and it stays intact enough that these lesser lives are drawn to it, again, like flies to a lantern, or like moths to a lantern, rather. And so we see them drawn to it, and then they become part of this thought form, and they allow it to actually work its way from just a thought to, again, some actual expression, some physical plane activity or thing that we can account for at some level. And so the idea that man can use the Deva evolution to call them down, if you will, and to use them, which is not really the best term either, but to make use of the services or their qualities, their nature, we can, at certain levels, take part in that and use that. And hopefully it would be for more selfish ends, but it is good to keep in mind that these lesser devas, and especially the lesser elementals, again, they don't have free will, they don't have a thinking process of their own, they're basically just caught up in the current. And so if a person is thinking a very one-pointed thought, whether it's a malign thought or a beneficial thought, whether it's a bad thought or a good thought, it matters little. The elementals and the lesser devas are still going to cling to that magnetism and still try to allow that thought to turn into some actual physical plane expression. So motive matters not in this instance. It just matters that a person is very one-pointed and focused. And so that's both bad and good, obviously. It depends largely on motive. But with these elementals and lesser devas not having their own free will, they are subject to the whims, wishes, and compulsions of the higher intelligence and higher will that may be imposed upon them. And so this may be a dangerous thing for some individuals to consider getting into. The Deva evolution is both a building and destroying, and that's something to keep in mind as well. When the thought form goes out, whether it be from the spiritual realms, from God, if you will, or at the level of a human intelligence, when that thought goes out, these devas, or if you will, or elementals, in their turn, cling to that thought and make it come about. And so the devas will build or destroy as they're set out, as they're charged to do. And so that being the case, they're not having will of their own, having to succumb to a higher will, they are going to just follow that current. They're going to follow that line of thinking with no motive or volition of their own. They're just going to be compelled and pushed along. And so they build or destroy according to this thought. So that's something to keep in mind. The aspect or tool that they use is fire. Now, this is not physical plane fire, but it's the fire that's characterized by the Hindu god Agni. And it's also the same concept of the biblical phrase, our God is a consuming fire. This vibrancy, this prana, life force, chi, orgone, whatever you choose to call it, this fire, this cosmic fire that permeates and animates all things, that brings life to all things, is also the same essence that is used, that is dispensed. And this fire, this spiritual fire, if you will, can either be synthetic and can be a joining together, or it can be destructive and it can destroy form. And that's something that might be a little bit confusing to some folks, but at a certain point in the evolution of all forms, consciousness is going to exceed the limitations of a form. And so at the end of a man's physical life, once that body has served its purpose and no more evolution and no more growth can take place in this particular instance, then the fires of life are pulled away, if you will, and what is no longer needed, what is old, worn out, and no longer useful is torn down, is destroyed. And so we see that in the instance of a human individual, perhaps an animal evolution, like the dodo bird, for instance. It's seen its day in the sun. The dinosaur evolution, it's come and gone, because, excuse me, that limiting form that these entities had no longer was useful in the scheme of things, and so it was withdrawn and destroyed. And so that being the case, we see that building and destroying going back and forth. And so the Devas answer to cycles and seasons, and they build or destroy accordingly. In the instance of a new racial type, or in the instance of a new continent arising, or a continent subsiding, again, animal, plant, any form, once it's reached its zenith, it's reached its apex, it's reached the height of what it has to offer for our evolution, it has to subside and it's broken down and destroyed. And then a new form is in turn built up that is adequate and right and proper for the consciousness to indwell the form. And so we see this building up and tearing down process going on and on and on all around us. But if we can understand somewhat of the methods and how and why, then we can get a fuller grasp of the whole evolutionary process, and we can understand our place in the evolutionary process in turn with the lower lives as far as plant, animal, mineral, and the higher evolution, and how this all ties together, if you will, and all helps to support the other. This whole hierarchical structure, this whole scaffolding, if you will, that underlies our evolutionary process, everything has its place within all of this. And so, that being the case, since the Deva evolution is based on desire, is based on want, that is also in itself a limitation that we have to at some point exceed and get past. And so there comes a point in a man's life when he reaches a certain level of evolution, when he has to break ties with the form, when he has to break ties with matter in order to exalt and emphasize the spirit that's held within the form, that's imprisoned within the form. And so we basically have to release ourselves from the desire and release ourselves from the Deva evolution, release ourselves from the influence of these lesser Devas and again these lower elementals that have built themselves into our physical body. Because once a man makes a return to spirituality and gets on the path of return to spirituality, if you will, then they have to accordingly build into themselves, what is right and proper for that particular consciousness. And so we ultimately detach ourselves from these lesser lives and loosen our ties from these lesser lives so that we can project ourselves forward and move on into the evolutionary process. And these lesser lives will go on and they will have gained through the benefit of having been part of a human body, and they will be in turn on the road to their own evolutionary process. And you can see that ultimately, as a great amount of time goes by, that these lesser Devas will work their way up the evolutionary ranks, and they in their turn will one day be human and pass that above human as well, ultimately. And so again, this process that tends to go on and on is all part and parcel of this evolutionary unfolding. Now, some people may be familiar with the term the etheric plane, the etheric or the vital or the energy plane, which lies just outside of the dense physical, that is not really readily available or readily perceivable by most individuals. But as time progresses and as these evolutionary cycles unfold, we see that in the very near future, that the etheric is going to be much more known and discernible to individuals, to humans in particular, and that they'll be able to see and sense some of these unseen activities. And so again, the concept that these elementals, or as they're termed through popular fiction and myth and what have you, fairies, pixies, sprites, gnomes, all of these little lesser lives, these little builders, if you will again, in turn, in a higher turn of the spiral, as the evolutionary process unfolds, our vision will be able to encompass their reality once again, and we'll be able to, at some level, interact with these lesser lives. And so, we'll be able to have contact with them and have some exchange with them. And this etheric aspect is becoming, again, more and more part of our physical plane expression. The dense physical will subside, and we will be lighter beings, if you will. We will be less dense and more etheric, if you can understand that concept. And so our whole evolutionary process is in the process of going through a change. And in the very near future, really, that's something that's needs to be emphasized as well, that relatively soon, let's say 50 to 100 years from now, it'll be more and more prevalent that people will exchange with these other lives, these evolutions, and again, be able to physically recognize them and work with them. Now, some of the devas of the physical planes have different names that are related to color. And just to give you some idea of a handful of these, from the lowest to the highest, if we start with the 4 groups of the violet devas. Again, these devas are tied to the etheric plane, the plane that's just above the dense physical that we're moving into in the near future. And they also have, in turn, part and parcel of their work is the healing of all things, and the free expression of energy through all form. And that's part of what they're involved in. And so if we understand the violet devas and their work that they're charged with, and also if we understand that violet is the color of healing, and so that ties in as well. Next, if we look to the next higher group, that would be the green devas, or the devas of the vegetable kingdom, and they preside over the magnetic spots of the world, like a Stonehenge, for instance, or Giza in Egypt. Probably some of the Native American sites. Really, any magnetized locality is under the charge of these green devas that keep these places intact, if you will, keep the magnetic resonance intact in that area until it can be tapped into and used for, again, our evolutionary progress. And so they work to charge and keep the magnetism into these localized areas, like a little well, if you will, a little well or pool that we can draw from. And then that magnetism can be spread out in its proper turn. The highest that I'm going to describe in this little part of the segment is the white devas, or the devas of air and water. And they're in charge of the electrical phenomenon, lightning certainly, and all of what we consider with storm activity and that sort of thing. And they also control seas, rivers, and streams. And so all of this flowing water, they have a part in protecting and watching over. Also, the white devas have, as part of their work, the protection and guiding of human individuals. And so their evolution, their work, ties in intimately with what is considered the solar angel, or the human soul, that is also our guardian angel. So that being the case, our guardian angel, our own soul, has a counterpart, or has helpers with these white devas, and they play an intimate role in allowing the guardian angel, if you will, or the soul, to have the free expression in the physical body, and to allow it to get its message and get its impulses down into the dense physical, so that we can make our moves along a spiritual path. And certainly certain people are going to be more predisposed and more ready for that spiritual impulse than others. A lot of humanity is still centered in the lower aspect of man, the centers below the diaphragm, and so it's not yet their time to partake of some of this evolution. And so the soul is not going to be very prevalent or prominent as something that they consider. And so it's going to be obscured by that, in that sense, and the whims of the soul, if you will, the dictates and directives of the soul are muffled and distorted because they don't have the clear channel. And that also ties into the analogy I made earlier of the whole ladder process, that we all are in the evolutionary ladder of unfoldment. Some are higher than others, but it's just simply a matter of the time traveled as opposed to certain entities being higher or lower. We all have our turn through the evolutionary process. Some make better use of that time than others. And certain laws factor in as well, such as karma and certain other universal laws that would either limit or expedite this whole process. Now again, the angels, as far as the work that's charged to them, the main work that we can attribute to the angels, or the Deva Evolution, is the destroying of old unused forms, or no longer useful forms, the building of new and proper form to be a fit vessel for a new level of consciousness. And they also heal, and that's again what I spoke of the violet devas and the healing that they do, and the trying to make sure that the free expression of energy has its way through form, whether that be the form of a mineral, plant, animal, human. They work in that area. Also, angels are teachers of men in some instances as well, and when we find ourselves asleep at night on the so-called astral plane, or the realm known as Devachan, or the realm of the devas or angels, in some instances we receive instruction. And so we receive instruction from these angels in some instances, and people may wake up in the morning feeling refreshed or feeling that they've gained some insight as a result of this interchange and exchange. Not everybody would obviously be conscious of it upon coming back into the waking state, but nonetheless this activity does take place, and many individuals do take the opportunity at night when they're sleeping, when the physical body rests, that their higher faculties are learning, that they're being taught, and they're basically in a classroom, for lack of a better term. Something else I'd like to get into a bit here towards the end is the concept of the archangels, and some of the better known ones, in particular Michael. Now, certainly some may be familiar with the way that spelling is and the pronunciation. But if we break down the word Michael, the EL ending means God, of God. And so to pronounce it how we would traditionally pronounce that name is not proper. So the proper pronunciation for that particular archangel is Michael. And this particular archangel, again, I spoke of at the beginning of the show, they're not they're highly evolved enough to where they're not going to taint themselves with our physical plane activity. They're not like the Luciferic angel, if you will, that descended down to tempt man, for lack of a better term. These other angels, these archangels, stay in the celestial realms, and they work with certain impulses. Now, again, the angels work according to cycles and seasons. And so Michael, in his turn, came in at a certain time to fulfill a certain work and to be a transmitter of a certain type of energy. Basically, this took place at the beginning of the 20th century. During the 19th century, there was a further turning away from spirituality in some sense, and we see that the concept of spirituality or Christ had to take a back seat to science, and so science became the predominant view, and the spiritual view took the back seat to this more materialistic approach. And some may be familiar with the 19th century phrase that God is dead, and this very much ties into this whole 19th century era that allowed for science, material science, to take the reign in man's consciousness as the authority as to what is and what is not, into being the authority of the seen and unseen both, in place of any kind of religion or spiritual impulse. And so after the 19th century was through, the 20th century came in, and we had the benefit of looking back, now being in the 21st century, at this whole impulse that took place over the past 100 years, in which Michael, the archangel, came to transmit at a certain level this impulse, this Christ impulse, or Christ consciousness. And so Michael was charged with revivifying or rejuvenating the latent Christ consciousness that is available to all men by virtue of the mystery of Golgotha, with what took place in that event at that particular time. And so we needed a further impulse. Even though it's been 2,000 years since the advent of Golgotha, man is still trying to assimilate those lessons, is still trying to bring into himself and understand what took place in that event. And so it's because of these cycles and seasons, and because of man becoming more intellectual and more spiritualized and more specialized, we can take part of this influence, this Michael influence, and we can take into ourselves, and not so much take into ourselves, but activate more so this Christ consciousness. And so this Christ consciousness is latent in all men, but in order for it to permeate and invigorate and do its work, this impulse has to come along. Now, certainly there are other impulses in evolution that work with Christ consciousness and work with Christ to bring forth different parts of the evolutionary process for humanity and the other kingdoms in nature as well. But considering the energy plane or the etheric plane that I spoke of earlier, that we're finding our way into more so and more so as we become more spiritualized, as we go from the descending arc back to the ascending arc, and we find ourselves on the ascending arc currently, that we're passing out of this dense, the low spot, the dense material nature, into, again, a more refined or what's termed etheric state. And so this, as we come up, as we make our way up this arc, we're going to find ourselves face to face more so with this impulse, this Christ consciousness impulse. And we can take it into ourselves or activate it more so. It's already in us again. I need to make that more clear. It's already in us. It's just a matter of activating it more so. And that's part of this work that certain of the angel evolution are charged with. And in this case, Michael. And certainly we may know and recognize the names of other archangels that in their turn have their own work to accomplish or have their own cycles to oversee. But again, currently the Michael influence is the important influence for our time. And this energy, this Christ energy that's being transmitted now. And so if we understand that energy, this energy, this Christ energy, is a balance between basically the Luciferic or, between the Luciferic and the Aromatic influence. Luciferic influence takes us away from the dense physical. It takes us into flights of fancy and takes us into the imagination, into this sort of realm, away from the dense physical and into more concepts as opposed to dense physical things. The aromatic influence pulls us down to the dense material, pulls us down into things of the world. And so we need a balance to be struck between these two pulling and opposing forces. And again, that impulse is Christ. And the helper or the conditioner of that energy within the angel evolution is Michael, the archangel. And so we are all part of the evolutionary process from the lowest all the way to the highest. It's just a matter of the part that we play, and all parts have their place. No small part is any less important than the greater part. It's just a matter of proximity, of placement, as to what their actual duties may be within the larger scheme. And so we're all like little gears in a mechanical device, and we all play an integral role in this unfolding process. And so that being the case, we can all work with intelligence, with understanding, if we so choose. Now, certainly, if a person does not have somewhat of a spiritual leaning or understanding, then these things may seem very fanciful and very out of reach and very just non-useful. But if we choose to understand this a bit more and try to think of some of the symbology of religion and some of the things that we've gained through myth, all myth at some level has some basis in fact. And so if we can trace back to that point and do some comparative research, we can see and understand that there were those that worked in the past times for the different unfoldments of man. Now, if we go back to an even further time, far back into antiquity with humankind, around the time shortly after we became individualized or self-conscious, shortly after the time of the Garden of Eden experience that's recounted for us in the Bible, we needed to get past that point, and we needed we needed guidance still at that point, because we had not gotten far enough into the dense physical world that we could operate in the same sense that we can now. We needed some help in the sense of knowing what was good for us in the sense of food, drink, and what was good, what plants were good for healing, what plants were poison, and certain things like this. And so, again, keeping in mind that some of the higher evolutions of angels did at some point in time partake of human evolution and have passed far outside of the human evolution, but still remain in order to allow us some form of guidance. That early on in man's evolution, that these higher guides, if you will, were able to take the form of humanity, take the form of some human, some wise man, some leader, a shaman, what have you, in the earliest days of mankind's unfolding the quality of self-consciousness, that we needed this guidance. And so one angelic individual would take on human characteristics and be a leader, if you will, of a certain group, a certain ethnicity, what have you, at a certain time, in order to give them what they needed, what cyclic impulse they needed, and what guidance they would need at that particular time. And as mankind has become more and more specialized, more and more intellectual, less emotional in some respects, then man has been able to find his own way. And again, science in many respects has replaced spirituality as our authority on things both seen and unseen. And in the future, those things will reconcile themselves, and it will be science ultimately that will prove the fact of the etheric or the energy field or the etheric body that's in relation to the human body, or all living things for that matter have an etheric or energy body that, again, people are becoming increasingly are able to see more and more, but science will be able to devise some way to test and to bring across as factual the etheric. And so that science is going to be one of the greatest benefactors in bringing this information out ultimately, but it certainly will be some time yet before we're able to get to that point. But it is not that long on the horizon before we're able to do that. I would like to go ahead and take a call and see what's going on. Hello, caller.
How you doing today?
Good, yourself?
Oh, fine, thank you. I was, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I was wondering, could you have, in your mind or in your philosophy, could you have good without bad, or vice versa?
No, you really can't. You have to have light, or you have to have dark in order to be able to see light, and vice versa. You have to have those poles, and once anything has a form, comes into manifestation, you find these polar opposites. You find positive and negative, you find light and dark, good or bad, female, male, just like a magnet. Contained within a magnet, you have a positive end and a negative end within the same unit. And so that being the case, no, you really can't get away from that differentiation that there is a positive and a negative. Even in man, we have a lower nature and we have a higher nature.
Right, and so God being the creator, all is within God.
True, you can look at it that way, yes.
And all creation, good and bad, is of God.
Yes, that is a little bit hard for some people to grasp, but yes, even the Luciferic influence and all that took place in the Garden of Eden and the fall and all those things had their part in the evolutionary process, and we needed that. We needed to get into this dense state in order to experience and grow and to rediscover and recapture spirit and to refine this dense physical vehicle with spirit.
So everything has its place.
Yes, very much so.
And
even a
at the
Hitler.
time, God being omnipotent and all-knowing, well, this is getting too philosophical, but
Go
I
ahead.
would say, well, in a sense, Earth is a school.
Oh yes, very much so.
So
Very much so.
The good and the bad, it's there for a reason. It's kind of like indemnity, or the, I don't know if the viewers would be familiar with that word, but it's like the law of, well, indemnity is a word you use in insurance. It's that you pay into what you get.
Mm-hmm.
And I would, in a sense, I would think that you have to have bad to learn.
Yes, absolutely,
You
absolutely.
have to be able to make mistakes.
Right, right.
Otherwise, if you don't make mistakes and you just everything's perfect all the time.
Right. We don't have that pain of learning. This school on earth is also called the school of the painful endeavor. And so if we don't learn, if the little child doesn't stick his finger in the fire and get burned, then he's never going to learn. I mean, he can be told all day long, don't put your finger in the fire, you're going to get burned. But until the kid actually puts his finger in the fire, feels the pain, and understands what that truly means, they're not going to make any real progress.
So it's tough love.
In a sense, yes. In a sense,
Okay.
yes. But it all has its place. But I do thank you for
I
your
like
call.
to think that anyway.
Oh yes, absolutely. I would encourage you to continue thinking
But
that way.
if it's fated, in a sense it is, it's fated that we all be a certain way in the end, right?
Ultimately, we're going to find our way back to spirit at some level,
So-
some sooner than others.
If God is outside of time, being the one who created time,
Mm-hmm.
then God knew what was going to happen before it happened. Therefore, it's like, why set the ball in motion? I don't know.
I'm not going to be able to get into that too much. I've got another call. I'm going to have to let you go,
Okay,
but
thanks.
that's a heavy concept that I'm not going to be able to delve into the last couple of minutes. Let me grab this other caller quickly. Hello, caller?
Yes, I have a question.
Sure, you're going to have to make this extremely brief. I'm sorry, I don't have much time left. Go ahead.
Okay, you were talking about the divas.
Mm-hmm.
They're white, blue, well, not blue, but purple.
There are blue Devas as well, yes.
Okay, I've seen little lights. Could those be divas?
Do you see, okay, could you describe the little light that you see?
They're floating way up in the air, like
Just a little point of
every
light?
now and then. They're just a little flash.
Okay, and what color are they generally?
They're generally white and purple. I've never seen a green.
Well, you're going to see more of that, more so. And that is an indication of this etheric vision coming into man's evolutionary process. I myself see those, and I don't think that I'm too delusional, but I've talked to other people too that have more spiritual inclinations that also see them as well. So that is part and parcel. That's an indicator for you that you are developing more so that etheric vision. And if you can, when you see those, just kind of give it some contemplation, give it some thought, and I think ultimately you'll find that you'll see how that's part of this whole process, that you can take advantage of that sight, that vision. It's kind of a little reminder right now of things to come, a little remembrance, if you will, or again, a reminder of what's going to come. Again, I think a lot of people are experiencing that, and if you probably find more so that if you're open to talking to people about that, you'll find that other people also are having the similar experiences like that. But I do
Yeah.
thank you for your call. Did you have another
thank
quick comment to add?
Oh, well, I've already seen angels, so I was all like, well, what are those little things? So,
Right. Okay, well, thank you for your call. Have a nice evening.
okay, you too.
Take care. Okay, well, I would like to thank everybody for taking the opportunity to watch Esoteric Science Roundtable. For the remainder of the month, we will still be here on Channel 10 from 8 to 9 every Tuesday. When the new schedule comes around in October, it's anybody's guess as to when our time slot will be. We'll try to give you a heads up as much as possible, but there's a chance we may retain the same spot. I don't know. It's not really looking like that's going to happen, but that would be nice, but we may have to change as well. So if you would be willing to take that into consideration. I'd like to thank my producer, Chris, for commanding the helm of the Starship Esoterica. I'd like to encourage everybody to please stay tuned for Chris Athanas and the Reality Expander television program that's coming up next on this very channel. And just like to thank everybody for, again, watching the show. And again, try to check us out again next Tuesday at 8 o'clock on Channel 10 until, again, the time slot changes and we get our new allotted time slot starting in October. Thanks, Austin.